So as I mentioned, this project aims to investigate the extent to which the US federal government used housing and transportation policy to intentionally segregate US cities along lines of race and class, as well as to analyze the ongoing impacts of this infrastructure and determine some potential solutions. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the negative effects of highways as they stand in American cities, the history of how we got here, and some solutions for how we can fix this. Before I get too far into it, sorry, I'm not good at doing my own introductions either. I am a PhD candidate at TU Delft here in the Netherlands, and I am a project manager at the engineering firm AECOM, engineering and design firm, based in New York City. And this is my ongoing academic project. So I recently had the opportunity to write about the project in the New York Times, in this article here. I'd recommend checking it out. It's similar to what I'm going to be presenting today, except professionally edited. So, a little more succinct. So the project draws on a list of 180 impacted cities, and these seen here are a few of the cities I've covered so far. And most of the examples that I display today are going to be from these cities. And I'm going to be talking about the project more so than the sort of design process that went into it. But in the process, you're going to see a lot of the different techniques that I use to sort of display this history. Okay. Well, I don't know if you saw there, it said out of memory, which I've never seen before, but this was supposed to be the complete list of cities. It's just a cool map, but it doesn't matter. These are the cities I'll be discussing today. But the complete list is roughly 180 cities that got money from two bills. It's the 1956 Federal Highway Bill and the 1949 Federal Housing Act. And those are the two bills responsible for funding highways and for urban renewal. And nearly all of the projects that I discussed today were funded by those two bills. So starting again with, what I said is some of the problems posed by freeways, how we got here, and what we can do about it. Starting with some of the problems, the first one is we still haven't stopped expanding them. So seen here is Houston. Houston is encircled by interstate highways, which divide the city along racial lines. And rather than pursuing ways to lessen this divide, the city is spending $10 billion to widen the highways, seen here. This is the right-of-way. This is an aerial or top-down view of that same project. So as part of that project, over 1,000 families will be relocated. This has actually already happened. So just happened a couple of months ago. So they already have been relocated. But about 500 of those families were in this public housing project here, the Clayton Homes, housing primarily Black and Latino residents. This is a demographic map of Houston showing how the highways really divide along racial lines. Since the mid-20th century, urban highway construction has worked as a powerful tool to segregate American cities and demolish communities of color. These roadways built on the legacy of redlining, creating walls of concrete and smog that separate Black and brown communities from white to this day. And while the period of government-led segregation in the United States is often discussed as history, projects like this one reveal that it's really anything but. These are some other recent and ongoing projects. This is Tampa, Florida. This highway cut through the Latino neighborhood of Ybor City. The formerly they're still the brick line streets that formerly connected the neighborhood are now dead end against sound walls. This is Miami, my hometown, not where I am now, but where I'm from originally, and that they're doing an expansion of the highway there that cut through Overtown, the heart of the Black community in Miami. This is in California, so it's not just in what we think of as sort of conservative states, it's also in more progressive states like California. All these houses are being torn down for highway expansions. The same project from a top view. So this is a noise map of the Bronx. So moreover, for the communities that remain divided by the highways, such as the Bronx, Considerable public health impacts persist. In the South Bronx, the ring of highways that surround the neighborhood creates this wall of noise that completely surrounds the neighborhood, and this maps right onto the highway network. And this purple here is as loud as a jackhammer. So tens of thousands of people live within that noise shed. And in addition, this ring of highways is responsible for the incredibly high rates of asthma in the borough, and in the South Bronx in particular, with nearly every census tract in the South Bronx being in the 99th percentile for asthma prevalence, and that's directly linked to the particulate matter from the automobiles. So now I'm just going to show a video real quick. So the Cross Bronx, which I was showing there, here we go. The Cross Bronx, which you can see being built here in this before and after image using aerial photography, historic aerial photography. So the Cross Bronx, along with the BQE and others in New York in particular, was very influential in the development of later highways in other cities, not just in terms of the route it took, but in terms of the institutions developed to actualize the project. And the tactics used, such as eminent domain and pairing highway construction with large-scale residential urban renewal projects. And rather than following a route that would have displaced far fewer people by cutting through parks and cemeteries, Moses overruled the person who planned it, overruled local objections and forced the highway through the heart of the Bronx. The highway was completed in 1955, and in the following year, the 1956 Federal Highway Act passed, which was heavily based on the Cross Bronx and provided 90% funding for similar roads in other cities. This is sparkling water, not beer. Excuse me. So jumping back to the presentation. So again, the Cross Bronx was incredibly influential in the development of later highways and was planned by this man here, Robert Moses. As discussed by Robert Caro in his biography of Robert Moses, two Roberts, Robert Moses viewed the city as more of a traffic problem than as an actual place, and seemingly delighted in swinging what he called his meat axe through neighborhoods with populations he despised, in particular Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods and immigrant neighborhoods. So while automobiles were viewed as the way of the future, the particular way in which Robert Moses actualized the adoption of automobiles ensured that it was a tool of segregation, both cutting through neighborhoods and isolating others. So this is some imagery of, again, how that plays out on the ground. The adoption of automobility resulted in the destruction of communities that had the least ability to resist in order to make way for these new roads. Seen here, the neighborhood of East Tremont, a Black and Jewish neighborhood, was completely gutted for the Cross Bronx. And in all, over 250,000 people were displaced by Robert Moses due to his highway projects in New York. And again, these projects in New York really became models that other cities emulated. So through the highways and associated urban renewal, Moses was able to open up the city centers to new development, to new commercial development, while quarantining undesirable groups such as the public housing facility seen here, home to mostly Black and Latino residents. So again, opening up new land in the city center for development, quarantining undesirable populations, and then these highways went out into undeveloped land on Long Island, facilitating the growth of suburbs, which was really one of the main points. So again, other cities follow similar tactics, using highways to partially destroy and quarantine particular neighborhoods. And these were heavily based on the earlier redlining maps, which graded. Up here is one of those redlining maps. I'm not going to get into redlining too much, but redlining was a policy about 20 years earlier from the period I'm discussing that started in the 30s that graded different American cities. This is Oakland. They created maps for every single city, grading different areas for investment worthiness based on race. So this is, again, Oakland, and the highways follow paths that sort of emulate these and split apart the different races, isolating them based on the belief that if you could protect different neighborhoods from sort of infiltration of undesirable racial elements, as they put it, that you could protect the property values. So the highways really serve to supercharge this by enabling builders to build basically walls of concrete and smog between different racial groups. This is Houston, showing a more detailed demographic view of what that looks like. And again, you can see the highways followed the earlier redlining maps and really isolated the different groups as they had been demarcated. Syracuse. My hometown of Miami. Miami followed a similar pattern, displacing over 12,000 people, nearly 100% of them Black. So these highways, as I mentioned, sliced through the existing city and in particular downtown areas, making possible the development of new car-centric suburbs on the outskirts of cities. And the real estate industry's widespread use of what were called restrictive covenants ensured that these new developments were closed for anybody considered non-white. So what a restrictive covenant was they would write into, this is an example of one, they would write into the deeds of new homes that these new homes could be sold only to quote unquote members of the Caucasian race. So this really incentivizes white flight, again, based on the idea that eliminating racial proximity is good for property values. And this, in addition to the GI Bill after World War II, which provided mortgages in the suburbs for returning veterans, this really creates an incentive for white flight. So center cities get drained out as the more wealthy residents leave. And because of this, American city centers enter a period of significant decay as these tax bases dry up. And so cities have to cut back municipal services, including firefighting, a very critical one, sewer maintenance, trash pickup. So American city centers enter a period of significant decay, and this begins the era of urban renewal. So the highways had cut through cities, demolishing neighborhoods, isolating neighborhoods, creating this incentive for white flight. And in addition, white flight had created the decay of the former core of the city as people had moved out to the suburbs. So also sponsored by federal legislation, like the highways, cities use this decay as an excuse to remake their civic cores for the convenience of the suburban white commuter. So the idea was to basically salvage the downtowns that people had left by remaking them in such a way that they could attract suburbanites, not necessarily to live there, but to come downtown to spend money. They built a lot of convention centers, stadia. I'll show some of those. But in this example in Boston, the Italian and Jewish neighborhood of the West End, which was deemed obsolete, whatever that means, by planner Ed Logue, this neighborhood was completely demolished in the 50s and replaced with mostly parking structures for Mass General, as well as government buildings, a large DMV, and a few others. So what this chart is showing is that these urban renewal projects, which again were aimed at the center city, aimed at trying to attract back white suburbanites, these urban renewal projects almost always disproportionately displaced people of color. Again, because the inner city has been drained out of their white population, and the idea was to remake them to attract people back and salvage the inner city economically. So what this chart that I made with the New York Times is showing is that these projects always disproportionately affected the non-white community. So for instance, in Philadelphia, you can see my mouse here, the non-white population in 1955 was about 20%, but the number of those, the amount of those displaced were 70% Black. In Philly, it's Black. In other cities, in New York, it's a lot of Puerto Rican immigrants. It differs per city. But again, it's always disproportionately the non-white population. So even though they only made up 20% of the population, 70% of those displaced were Black. And that pattern repeats itself across basically every sizable city. And because of this, people identified this at the time or knew this was happening. Civil rights leader James Baldwin famously said that urban renewal means Negro removal. that's what it means. And the federal government is an accomplice to that fact. And he was talking, when he says the federal government was an accomplice to that fact, he's really talking about these these federally funded urban renewal and highway programs. So cities, using these urban renewal monies, paved over vibrant neighborhoods and replaced them with amenities focused on suburban commuters. As I mentioned, in this case, a government complex where a church and subway stop formerly stood. This church is in This is Roxbury, which is officially known as the heart of Black culture in Boston. And in addition, lots of units of housing were destroyed, and again replaced with this police department. More images of the types of neighborhoods that were destroyed. This is Chicago, Maxwell Street. It was an immigrant, Jewish, Black neighborhood, Italian, Greek, had a famous outdoor market that was completely destroyed for an expansion of, again, mostly parking facilities. This example in Atlanta, the Black neighborhood of Mechanicsville, just south of downtown, was completely destroyed for this interchange, and then later this stadium. And big stadia like these, in addition to big convention centers, big entertainment complexes, are really typical of the sort of type of salvaging they were doing. Again, these were designed to get people to come into the city center and spend money after they had left for the suburbs. In some cases, urban renewal projects were simply abandoned halfway through, but not before neighborhoods were completely demolished. In this case, in Philly, 10,000 people were displaced when the neighborhood of Eastwick was demolished. But the developer could not find anyone who wanted to live in the new houses he was proposing, so it was just abandoned. So a key feature of urban renewal was the destruction of public places, again, in order to remake cities for this new suburban constituency. And Heather McGee wrote a book recently describing, it's called The Sum of Us, and she describes how racism targeted at specific groups has really had a detrimental effect for all Americans. And in this example of public pools, so public pools are one of these public spaces that were demolished for urban renewal. Or in this case, cities around the country used to have public swimming pools. These used to be very common in American cities, but they were segregated. They were whites only. But in the 50s, when the Supreme Court orders desegregation of these facilities, rather than desegregate and integrate, many of these cities actually drain them and demolish them, or in some cases, bury them under a highway. And many cities do this specifically to avoid, they do this because they're trying to avoid integration. They're upfront about that. St. Louis, Buffalo, all across the country. So in the name of upholding segregation, we destroyed a public good and privatized it, because after the destruction of these public swimming pools, that's when you see the rise of backyard swimming pools in the suburbs, particularly in areas where that wasn't the vernacular, like the North. So again, privatized a public good to avoid integration. And that's, to some extent, what we did here with public transportation. This is one of those public amenities that was destroyed in order to create these highway systems. Philadelphia, much of its network was completely destroyed. I know I'm going pretty long here, so I'm going to go through these. And you can see all of these on my website, segregationbydesign.com, as well as my Instagram at segregationbydesign. So again, these were one of those amenities that were destroyed in order to promote suburbanization. So that's a bit of the history of how we got here. So what can we do about it? These are some of the projects I'm working on in my professional work at ACOM. So this is a map of pedestrian deaths in the Bronx. One of the predictable results of having put all these highways through neighborhoods of color is that there's a racial bias in pedestrian deaths. Communities of color see significantly more pedestrian deaths, and that's even when corrected for miles traveled. So one of the things we can do is make these places, is try to mitigate the damage of these highways. So this is a project in the Bronx that I worked on, where we took a section of highway and made it no longer a limited access automobile highway, added crosswalks, added queues to slow drivers down, narrowed the lanes, reduced the number of lanes, and reopened this park. This is the Cross Bronx Expressway over here. This was actually used to be a theme park, sort of similar to Coney Island in the Bronx, but it burned down during that era of basically when firefighting departments were eliminated in a lot of these communities. And it was later used as a staging area for the construction of the Cross Bronx, and then basically just left fallow for decades. So what we did was reconnected it with these crosswalks. It's not as good as it could be. We would like to have eliminated even more lanes, but we take what we can get. So making this more pedestrian friendly and connecting it to the riverfront. So this is some of the work we did, rebuilding this bridge, rebuilding the park. So we're now trying to replicate that success in the Bronx by potentially, this is the Cross Bronx here, much of it is below grade. So one solution we're seeking is potentially building a cap over it, a series of deck parks that can potentially reconnect the neighborhood. But other countries have shown that even more bold solutions are possible. So here in the Netherlands, where I'm studying currently, Utrecht removed a highway and brought back some of its historic canals. And then in Seoul, a highway that cut through the middle of the city was removed and replaced with the linear park that has been incredibly popular. So I know I'm running short of time, so I will end there. And again, you can check out my website for more.